So far we've discussed basic open chords, including majors, minors, and a handful of sevenths. We've looked at beginning soloing concepts, shell voice chords, capos and transposition, and even some ukulele chords. Still, something's missing. Well, it's high time we address the obvious, which is, of course, bar chords. Now, I remember when I was about 10 years old, this would have been 1979 or 1980, an older player told me, and I'm paraphrasing here, wait till you get to bar chords. They're really hard and they'll hurt your hands. And this advice, more like hazing actually, stuck with me for the next couple of years until I finally successfully got my hands on a bar chord F. Now, in all fairness, he was right. It did hurt my fingers for a bit. And for a while, every time I encountered a new bar chord in a piece of sheet music, I treated it as an entirely unique structure and I would work to commit this new piece of information to memory. So yeah, I guess he was right about that too. They were hard. There were just so many bar chords to learn and then memorize. Well, after about a year, I was learning on my own, without the internet no less. Out of the blue, I spotted the pattern. And it was at that point I realized that bar chords, if anything, might be easier to learn than all of the distinctly unique open chord shapes. There's definitely a system in place. Now, there are still a few things we have to commit to memory, but it's not nearly as daunting as treating all 36 major, minor, and seventh chords as distinct, unique data packages to be processed, analyzed, memorized, and regurgitated. In fact, if you've kept up with the material we've covered on the channel so far, you'll realize you already have all of the core knowledge at your fingertips. So let's dive in and learn all about bar chords. So here's the thing, if you know how a capo works, you already know your bar chords, for real. So now might be a great time to revisit episode 9, the automatic transposition machine, and I'll be here when you get back. So just like a capo, your bar finger essentially mechanically retunes your guitar. If you bar at a given fret and then with your remaining fingers make any familiar open chord shape, you've just produced a bar chord. It's that simple. Now, what's not so simple is figuring out how to name the chords once we've placed our fingers. So let's lay some groundwork. Let's revisit the chromatic scale. Now, the chromatic scale simply occupies 12 frets on any available string. In other words, if we start with an open A string and proceed one fret at a time, we get this chromatic sequence. A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F sharp, G, G sharp, and then back to A at the 12th. By the way, write this sequence down. It'll give you a handy reference guide you can use until you can recite the chromatic scale forwards and backwards. Now, if we start from an open E, we get the same sequence, only this time beginning with E. E, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, and E. Now, any place we can identify a given note, we can reckon that note as the root, or the note that names a chord. So, since we've modeled the chromatic scale on the A and E strings, it only makes sense to proceed using the A and E shapes, simply because their roots are based off those respective open strings. So, let's begin with an E chord. Now, I think we can all agree that this is an E, right? So the chromatic scale then tells us that if we move the E up one fret, or one notch in the chromatic scale, we now have an F chord, correct? Well, wait a minute, that didn't work out right. It's a cool chord, but it's not correct for this example. Why? Well, we moved the notes of the chord up one fret, it should be an F, right? Well, even though we moved the fingered notes up one fret, we neglected to take the open strings as well. This is where the bar finger comes in. Now, before we bring our index or bar finger in, let's reset our E chord, but let's use the wrong fingers. Fingers 2, 3, and 4. Now, let's pretend that we have to play the open strings with our index finger by fretting every open string behind the nut. Now, this time, when we bring our E shape up one fret, bring your index finger up by one fret also, and now we have our bar chord model. Press all your fingers down firmly, and we should have a fully formed F chord. Okay, so can we do the same with our A shape? Sure. Make an A chord with the wrong fingers. Pretend to play the open strings behind the nut, then move the entire fingering up 1 fret, and we get which chord? An A sharp chord. Makes sense, right? It actually makes more sense to call it a B flat chord, so let's go with that. I'll explain why some other time. Now, this fingering can be a problem, especially on the lower frets, so consider playing the shape 1, 3, 3, 3, 1. Now, if the first string comes out a little muffled, it's okay. Just make sure your third finger isn't fretting the first string. Now that we know a couple of bar chord shapes, where do we go from here? Okay, if you place your first finger on the 6th string, 5th fret, we get the note A. If we fret the 5th string at the 5th fret, we get the note D. And if we slide that D up to the 7th fret, we get an E. Now, think about that for just a second. These are the primaries in the key of A. So if we build bar chords from these roots, we can play the primaries as bar chords in the key of A. Simply build an E-shaped grip on the 6th or the E string root for the A chord. Build an A-shaped grip for the 5th or the A string roots for the D and the E. Now with these 3 chords, we can now play through a simple 1, 4, 1, 5, 1 progression or through a blues. So this is cool and all, but why bother when we can play A, D, and E open? After all, the open chords are a little more resonant. Well, let's go back to the chromatic scale for a second. If we move everything we just played down 1 fret to the 4th, we now get A flat, D flat, and say it with me, E flat. Also, if we move up 1 fret to the 6th, we get B flat, E flat, and say it with me, F. Well, there are no standard open equivalents for any of those chords, so we've just gained 5 new, very usable major chords. Now, can we do the same thing with minor chords? Sure, same routine we just discussed, but use A and E minor shapes. So, E minor shape, A minor shape. Remember, 5 is always major. What about 7th chords? Yep, just use E7 and A7 chord shapes. So let's take a minute to recap and reassess what we've covered so far. 1. The chromatic scale allows us to identify individual notes anywhere on the fingerboard. As long as we know how to identify a note on the fingerboard, we can use it as the root of any bar chord shape. 2. Root 6 or E-type chords have their root on the 6th string, and root 5 or A-type chords have their root on, you guessed it, the 5th or the A string. 3. Standard bar chord shapes are simply misfingered chord shapes, which allow your first finger to act as a temporary capo. 4. Bar chords allow us to play chords which have hitherto been unavailable to us since there are no standard open equivalents, and this includes all the flat and sharp chords. 5. Anything you can do to an E or an A major chord, you can do to an E or an A-shaped bar chord. For instance, if you remove your index finger from an E major chord, you get an E minor. Now, if you remove your middle finger from an E major shaped chord, it too becomes minor. Get it? 6. Any standard open chord can become a bar chord. More on that later, though. And 7. One last thing. If you have access to an electric guitar, learn your bar chords on that guitar. The lower action and lighter strings will generally help you get the feel of the bar chord grips under your fingers. Once you've achieved some consistency on the electric, you can transfer those shapes to the acoustic much, much more easily. So a great way to begin mastering bar chords is to saturate your practice with them. And running them through different blues progressions is the most effective way I know to not only saturate your fingers with bar chord shapes, but to learn the different positions that all the different keys live in. So try practicing your bar chord placement by playing through the major primaries play along, which is play along number 4. And if you can get through all 5, you're well on your way to knowing and being able to use them all. Finally, let me return to the guitarist who hazed me back in 1979. Even though he may have been busting my chops, his advice was really valuable. So I'm going to pass the same advice on myself. But in the interest of not being jerky about it, I'm going to frame it a bit differently. So remember, learning to master bar chords is likely to make your fingers hurt, but it's transitory. Your fingers will get stronger and tougher. Think of practicing bar chords like lifting weights. Also, bar chords are hard to locate at first. Remember, the more you practice placing your chords, the quicker the process becomes. You'll be locating a handful of commonly used bar chords reflexively in no time. Bar chords can be challenging, but there's no reason to let them intimidate you. Remember, please like, share, and subscribe if you're enjoying the channel's content, and feel free to leave comments or suggestions for any topics you might like to see in future videos. Also, hit the notification bell so you always know when new content is posted. My name's Dave Holland, and thanks for watching String 'em Up. Have fun, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.